Michael said, most of my work is in health behavior change, and sort of helping people with changing their lifestyle habits, physical activity, weight management, and things of that sort. And so I often talk to behavioral scientists and work on what I call just-in-time adaptive interventions, so trying to think about how to make interventions be more timely and do the right thing in the right places. But since this is an HI seminar, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the thinking you've been doing recently about how design changes how well these interventions work, okay? And so, just to set the stage, I'm going to start with a quote from one of my colleagues who is a very senior behavioral scientist who has been developing, so she was one of the leaders in early digital interventions for weight management. And she's a very, very smart person, but I think this represents how a lot of people from the health sciences and the behavioral sciences think about interventions, right? And so basically what she says is that she's been doing this for a long time, and whether she used old school Palm Pilots or Android phones or iPhones or whatever it is, as long as she puts the right ingredients into these things, her weight loss interventions pretty much work equivalently, right? It doesn't matter how beautiful they are, it doesn't matter how well they designed they are. And really the assumption here is that really what matters are these things that behavioral scientists refer to as behavior change techniques, which are basically, you can think of them as the active ingredients of how mobile health interventions and how other digital interventions work, which are the things that you're asking the person to do, right? Whether you're asking them to set goals, whether you're sending them a reminder, whether you're asking them to plan things. And there's an extensive literature that has basically summarized the behavioral science work over the last 70 or 80 years that has basically extracted these various operations that we're referring to as behavior change techniques from that literature to say these are the things that we need to be asking people to do in order to help them change their behavior, right? And a lot of the evidence in behavioral science, think about systematic reviews and meta-analyses, really deal with sort of trying to get evidence for which of these various behavior change techniques are effective, for what kind of conditions and for what populations, right? But the assumption here is that if you do the right things, right, if you're actually, things are going to work pretty well, right? As long as the design is reasonably usable, you don't have to worry too much about design. But we all know the design actually does matter. Right? That often how you design these things can make a big difference in terms of how people experience them and even how effective they are. I'll give you some examples of that. So what I want to do for the next 40 minutes or so is give you some sense of how we can think about this issue in a little bit more robust way. And so to put some flash on this notion that sometimes design matters and sort of how to think about when it does, right? And so I first got interested in this almost 20 years ago. When I was a PhD student, I had the good luck to work with James Lendek, who is now here, and Sunny Consalvo, who is at Google, on one of Sunny's early projects called UbiFit, which is one of the early smartphone interventions for physical activity. And what Sunny did with these things, and we were using Windows mobile phones at the time, is she developed this little garden display that sat on the lock screen of the phone that basically gave people feedback on how active they've been over the course of the week and whether they've accomplished their physical activity goals, right? And inside there was an app that did the same stuff where you could log the activity, and also a sensor that was used as part of the system would automatically track some of these activities. But Sunny wanted to know whether having this kind of a garden display in addition to the app would actually make a difference, right? So she ran a study where we basically saw that when people had a version of this application that had a garden display, their trajectory of physical activity over time was different than for people who had the exact same application and the sensor, but without the garden display, right? In the latter case, people would sort of decay over time, while if people had the garden display, that they would stay flat. And the question is, why? Why was this difference here, right? And if you think about this from the perspective of behavior change techniques, right? A lot of things about these two versions of the application were exactly the same, right? So what the thing did was pretty much the same. It provided feedback on behavior and goal progress. It allowed people to self-monitor, and it allowed people to set goals, right? So you couldn't do anything more with the garden display version of the app than you could do without it. But one actually worked better than the other, right? And so when we started thinking about it, really the key thing here that we came up with is that not having to go into an app, right, to see your progress, allowed people to see the feedback on the physical activity a lot more often. So basically, they would see it every time they would pull a phone out of their pocket, right? And so that frequency of the feedback was probably what made the difference, right? We didn't have any data to actually, say that that's exactly what happened, but I started thinking about like what makes a particular instantiation of a behavior change technique different.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Do you think that, I'm not a behavioral nudge expert. Would they say that that is actually a different behavior change?
I'll come to
technique?
that in a second.
Yeah.
But my sense is for this, it's not. And I'll tell you, I'll explain in a couple of minutes why I think it's different. But the kind of, that frequency was probably what matters, is really what came from the qualitative data, right? So when we interviewed people, they would say, every time I would look at the phone, I would see this feedback, and that was really great, right? But I'll come back to Michael's question in just a second, because I think part of what we need to really be thoughtful about is, when is something a different behavior change technique versus a different design of the same technique? And I have some thoughts about how that works. And then I got to Michigan, and I started teaching this class. I developed this class called SI 684, which is about design of consumer health technologies. And this is kind of a funky class, right? So what I'm asking the students to do for a big chunk of the class is read papers in psychology, right? Papers on different kinds of different theories and different kinds of behavior change techniques. And then we think about how you can implement those very theories in digital interventions, and what the trade-offs of different designs might be, right? So we might sort of have a week that looks at goal setting, right? And they would read all of the sort of foundational papers in goal setting, like Locke and Latham's, American Psychologist review article, and sort of learn things like this, right? That goal setting tends to, the effectiveness of goal setting tends to scale with the difficulty of the goals, that self-efficacy moderates how well goal setting works, that commitment is a big moderator, and so on, right? But when you actually start to design for this, turns out there are a whole bunch of other questions that you have to make some decisions on. Like, where in the interface you're going to put goal setting? How many goals to set? What kind of time frame to use? Should you use daily goals? Should you use weekly goals? Is there a hierarchy of goals? And so on. And the question becomes, which of these questions actually matter? Right? And which of these design decisions actually don't matter very much, right? And so I think a key thing that we as a sort of design field need to be thinking about is, can we think about the role that design plays in these interventions in a principled way? And over the last few years, and what I want to tell you now is how I've been starting to think about this. And a key part of this is to really think about these interventions in a causal way. Right, so we've taken directed acyclic graphs, which many of you are familiar with, and we created this adaptation of them that we're calling causal pathway diagrams. They basically try to be explicit about the role that various nodes play in how an intervention works, right? And so we sort of distinguish between preconditions, which are the things you can think of it as light switches, that if a precondition is not present, the whole causal chain breaks down, right? We distinguish between moderators, which sort of increase or decrease the effectiveness of a particular intervention. And then what you have in the stem, which is the sort of the middle line that goes horizontally, is sort of a set of outcomes that you would expect if the intervention is working how you intend it to work, right? So what are the proximal outcomes that might show up first, and then how these leads to the more distal health outcomes and implementation outcomes that you care about, right? In this case, this is just a sort of a reminder within a medical record to help clinicians develop screen for depression on a regular basis, right? And one of the big barriers in doing this is that clinicians are overwhelmed. They have a very short visit. They're trying to do a bunch of stuff at the same time, talk to the patient, chart, do all of these things. And so we think that sort of divided attention is a big barrier here, right? And so the reason that a reminder might work is because it brings, it increases the salience of the need to screen, right? So you can sort of even think about these causal diagrams. They're giving you even sort of without ever deploying anything, some basic way of gauging plausibility, whether a particular intervention is a good match for the problem that you're trying to solve, right? All right, so what does this all have to do with the design? So what it has to do with the design is that I'm increasingly thinking that the design matters. What it differentially changes how particular set of moderators or preconditions for intervention are actually activated, right? And so if you have, and this now gets to your question, Michael, if what you're doing creates a new stem for a diagram, right? It's that if you have a different intervention. But if the change in the design is only messing with the stuff that is up and down, right? With the preconditions and moderators, you can think of it as basically the design is changing these effect modifiers on the intervention. And I think a lot of the things when the design ends up mattering is that it does that differentially, right? And of course you can have things that do both of these things, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that as well. But really, the way that I'm thinking about when design matters is when it actually changes these things that modify how an intervention works in terms of the causal process through which that intervention is working. So let me give you a few examples of what that might look like. So one of them is, early on we developed this mobile health interventions for physical activity called HeartSteps. And for the purposes of our discussion, I mean, so it was intended initially for sedentary individuals. We've customized it for cardiovascular disease prevention. But in the first version of this intervention, we had two what we're calling push interventions, basically things that we send to people via push notifications, right? One of them were basically a little prompt asking people to be active, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. And the other one is a prompt asking people to make a plan how they're going to be active on the following day, right? And both of these are theory-based. And so activity suggestions you can think of as being cues to action. And what we try to do is make these things really, really actionable. So we would use the location data and the weather data and the sort of time of the day to customize what kind of message we would send to a person, right? And so to make sure that what we're sending to people was appropriate for their current circumstances, to make it more likely that they would be able to do something with that in the near term, right? And we had two versions of these things, right? One of them were just asking basically people to go for a short walk. Think about roughly 1,000 steps or 10 minutes or so walking. And the idea was that if you do a few of these things over the course of the day, that should increase your physical activity. But there are also just so many ways you can ask people to walk. Like you run out of options pretty quickly. So we had this second bank of messages that are basically just asking people to move around a little bit to disrupt sedentary time, right? So we would ask them to dance while cooking or look at the clock and do squats or whatever it is, because they could be a little bit more engaging, right? So we originally developed these little second bank of messages purely to help with the engagement, to make them funny, to make them cute, right? And both of these were basically sent in the same way, and I'll show you that in a second. The other intervention component was planning, and this is a version of what in psychology is referred to as implementation intentions, which is basically a form of planning where you're very specific about when, where, and how you're going to do something. Okay, and what we did is basically, again, sort of thinking about engagement, the way that if you sort of run an experiment on implementation intentions in social psychology, you bring people to a lab, you give them a piece of paper, and you ask them to write a plan for something, like when they're going to do their math homework over the holiday break, right? And so people write down a plan. So sort of digital version of that is basically just a text box, right? This is basically sort of a high fidelity version of how implementation intentions are typically used, right? But we also know that most of our lives are pretty routinized. Like we do same stuff time and time and again, right? And so in order to decrease burden, especially since we were sort of initially focusing on older people who don't particularly like to type on the phone, we figured, like, if they make a plan, we'll just make that plan available to them in the future, so some of the time they can just pick a plan that they already made that might be appropriate for the next day, right? And so again, we sort of had these two forms of planning where we were originally just thinking it would be the second version would just be used to reduce burden, and if it works just as well, you can just use that instead of having people have to write the plan at the same time. And then we ran a study to try to actually look at these two components. And for those of you who are not familiar with micro-randomized trials, this is a new experimental design that my colleague Susan Murphy developed about 10 years ago, which basically is intended to help you get a signal on whether a particular part of a digital health intervention is doing what it's supposed to do in the short term, okay? And so the way that this works is that every time you have a chance to provide a particular intervention, let's say you want to send someone a reminder to take their hypertension medication, which happens once a day, right? So you have what is called the decision point, which is once a day at the time when a reminder might be sent, right? And then let's say you have an instrumented pill bottle that can record whether someone took a reminder or the medication or not, right? And so with a micro-randomized trial, if you want to see whether reminders help, every single day for every person in the study, you would randomize whether you send a reminder or not, right? And after each one of those randomizations, you would collect what is called the proximal outcome, the near-term outcome, which is in this case whether they took the pill. And then you can basically analyze, like, do people take pills more when you send them a reminder versus not? But also, since you have a randomization over time, right? So it's a sequential randomization. You can start doing analysis like, does it matter like what the weather is like outside when the reminder comes, or does it matter if the people are at home or at work, right? You can actually look at the contextual moderation of these things, which is pretty interesting, right? Why is it interesting? Because it helps you make decisions about how you should optimally provide these interventions, right? And so we did this with both of these components, right? So in the case of activity suggestions, we had 5 decision points a day. So 5 times a day, we had the time when we might be able to send someone an activity suggestion. And what we did is for each person in the study, we randomized at each one of those 5 points every day. One, whether we send them a suggestion or not. And then if we randomize them to send them a suggestion, whether we would send them a walk-in suggestion or one of these low antecedentary suggestions. And then we looked at sort of how much they moved over the 30 minutes after that randomization. That was our proximal outcome. And then we did something similar for planning as well, where basically every night we would randomize whether we would ask a person to plan for the next day. And then when we did ask them to plan, we would randomize whether they would get the sort of to write a new plan, or we would give them a list of the previously made plans that they could just choose from one. And in this case, our proximal outcome was the step count on the next day. Right? And the idea is that basically, if you plan a larger bout of activity for the next day, that should get reflected in how much you walk on the next day. So let me talk about what we saw in planning first, right? And so if you combine both classes of planning, both types of interfaces, and you compare them to no planning, there's not much going on. But if you actually start separating them, you start seeing a signal, right? So when people were asked to do to write a new plan, they ended up with about 400 or 500 steps more per day than when they didn't plan, right? And this was starting to get marginally significant given the small sample size. But then when you actually start taking moderation into account, moderation by contextual factors, basically our participants did not like planning on weekends, and nothing worked on weekends. But on weekdays, an open-ended plan provided almost 900 steps over not planning at all, while the other interface didn't do squat. No effect on not planning. And what's also interesting, and this is actually relatively rare for mobile health interventions, is that then when the open planning worked, that effect stayed constant over time. Like it didn't actually degrade over time, and you'll see in a second why I'm pointing that out. So open-ended planning worked, but picking from a list didn't. And the question becomes why? And so here is where this is really a design variation, right? We have two, yeah.
Did it continue to micro-randomize over the 6 weeks?
Yeah, we micro-randomized every single day over the 6 weeks for everyone.
And do you feel like, have you, for example, looked at streaks where it would, like just by random chance, they were getting assigned to the planning, for 5 days in a row?
Right. We didn't look at streaks for planning, but we did for the other intervention, and I'll show you some data about that, right? Because actually this moderation by dose ends up being pretty interesting. Yeah.
I ask because in some of the previous work we had done on like more outside of health and more like time spent on like Netflix and so on.
Yeah.
It was not the intervention so much as it was the rotation, like the change of intervention that sort of prevented the banner blindness.
Right.
That was actually the thing that was the mechanism.
Yeah. And we actually got something very similar to that for the activity suggestions that I'll show you in a little bit. I can take a look at the data on planning. That would actually be pretty interesting. But I mean, with all of these results, really, you're sort of marginalizing over those variations in sequences, right? And we're still seeing these effects with that. But but the question is like, why does this version method work and the other one doesn't? So this is kind of how psychologists think about implementation intentions. Like this is the causal diagram, simple causal diagram of implementation intentions. This is Peter Govitzer and Pascal Sheeran that have done a lot of work in this space. And really the key mechanism here is that when you create this kind of a really, really specific plan, what happens is there is sort of encoding of the link between the context in which the action should take place and the action itself, right? And they've done some MRI studies that actually are collecting neurophysiological data about this. And then when you encounter the context in which that you're supposed to do this action, basically your brain can just trigger the action without the need for further deliberation. And this is why implementation intentions are actually pretty powerful, is because they remove this need to make a decision again. Do I want to do this, right? But basically, the action can just be triggered automatically when you encounter the context. And clearly, sort of encountering the context is a precondition for this to happen. If you don't encounter the context, nothing happens. And there's a fair bit of work on sort of some of the other moderators, like conflicting goals. If you have a strong conflicting goal with the action, then that can derail how implementation intentions work or not. But turns out there is another really important precondition, which is that you need, for the actual planning to do this kind of encoding, you need some attention during the actual process of planning. And this, we think, is what was going on with this difference between the open-ended planning and the planning that was speaking from the list. If we look at the log data, it takes people about a second to move through the screen where they pick from a list. And it takes them substantially longer. It was something like 7.5 seconds to do a very quick plan and so this added friction of having to write a plan, we think, is actually enforcing a certain amount of attention to the process of planning, which is actually necessary to make this kind of neural encoding take place, right? And so what the interface is doing in this case is actually forcing this important precondition. And so what we ended up doing for sort of future versions of our HeartSteps is creating a form that you still allow. And so you can now start thinking about, you can do systematic research, how much attention is needed here, and what kind of interfaces are still usable and relatively low burden, while still engaging enough attention for that encoding to take place, right? And so that's sort of, in this particular case, it sort of hit a really important precondition. So let's talk about activity suggestions, because this is really funky as well. So again, all of these things were provided in the same way, right? We would randomize people 5 times a day, and then when they were sent the message, they would just get the text notification with the content of the message. And here too, we actually see that these two types of messages did not work the same way. And in particular, walk-in suggestions did result in some increase in steps, but these anti-sedentary suggestions didn't, even though people really liked them. When we interviewed them, they say, these were a lot more fun. But they didn't seem to do anything, at least initially, when we started looking at the data. All right? The other thing that was interesting is that the walk-in suggestions worked pretty well at the start of the study. So at the start of the study, they added 271 steps. That's only in the 30 minutes following the randomization. That's actually a fair bet, right, for 30 minutes. But then what we saw is that with every passing day, that effect would go down, right? And by the end, by about 3 weeks in, they stopped doing anything at all, right? And so now we're thinking about why, right? Why is this sort of effect going down? And one sort of easy question, hypothesis is that it's habituation. What is habituation? Think of habituation as sort of the decrease in response. And this concept comes out of early psychology, the early 20th century psychology, having to do with reflexes. If you go to a doctor to test your knee reflex, and they hit you with a hammer, right? Initially your knee will pop up, right? But if they keep hitting it over time, that reflex sort of stops, and you stop getting a response until the reflex recovers, right? And we see this kind of dynamic often. Probably for those of you who get a lot of notifications, probably you see this thing with notifications. The more notifications you get, the less likely you are actually look at the notification, because you just get inundated with them, right? And so we thought maybe this is what's going on, right? In which case it's really not the time, but to your point, it's actually how much we're bothering people. So I'll spare you of the gory details of actually the analysis, but what we started doing is looking at sort of how these messages are modified by the dose, how many messages people receive over the last few days, right? Across both types of interventions. And what we found was actually pretty interesting. And so what this big ass regression table is saying is that we are actually seeing 2 different patterns of responding. So for walking suggestions, there is this initial impact, and that impact continues to fall down by the day in the study. So it's purely time-based thing. But for anti-sedentary suggestions, when we started doing moderation by dose, we actually get the main effect. We actually get the effect of anti-sedentary suggestions, but that effect is decreases by how many previous messages someone has received over the last few days. And we've done this analysis for the 3 days, and 5 days, and 7 days. We get basically exactly the same results. So how many messages someone gets seems to modify the impact of an anti-sedentary suggestion, but not walk-in suggestion. And the question is like, what's the why is this the case, right? It's not engagement because we know that planning stayed effective over the course of the whole study. So here's one hypothesis. So you can think about these cues to action as sort of working through, and this is sort of a riff on theory of planned behavior, but basically the intention to follow the suggestion being either due to two big influences. One of it is what we sort of often is referred to as attitude, like how valuable do you think this thing is, and what's sort of shaping that. And that attitude can also can take a hit from the burden of what you're asking someone to do, right? And then the other one is called, you can think of it as self-efficacy or perceived behavioral control. It's like, are you actually able to do this? So for what we think is going on for anti-sedentary suggestions is that the main burden is actually coming just from the annoyances of receiving messages. But people are getting a fair bit of value from just the engagement, that these are kind of funny and engaging. So the value is coming from engagement, but most of what is driving the burden, which would be the reducing the attitude, is really coming from the frequency, right? Well, for walking suggestions, the most value is coming from the fact that these are actually pretty actionable, and people will tell us this in interviews where they really liked when they got something that was really well tuned to their current context. But it's a more effortful thing, like you're asking people to go for a walk. So there is a burden that comes from the effort. But also what we think is going on is that the value of taking a short walk started reducing over time. Like, so this is sort of behavioral economic hypothesis that just how people think about the value of taking a very short walk, that is getting reduced over time. So the mechanisms are working slightly differently for these two things, even though the actual, the content is presented in exactly the same way. It's just that the ask of the user, right? Is it just to move around for a little bit or to go for a walk is different across these two, in which case it's activating different parts of this causal pathway, right? That's a hypothesis. Like, you can, again, run a whole bunch of studies that you can then try to get at more detailed evidence for this. But that might explain why this is going on. Let me give you one last example, and this is from an intervention that my PhD student Sue Choi has been working on over the last couple of years. And Sue is really interested in helping people to enjoy physical activity more, right? And so developed this system called Walk to Joy, which is intended to basically improve what are referred to as affective associations with physical activity. Think about the affective associations as being two things. One are, you can think of it as sort of gut reactions to the thought of something, right? So if you were, bullied in school during gym class, and someone to ask you to go for a run, there's going to be sort of a gut reaction, negative gut reaction that just immediately gets triggered, right? Those are affective evaluations. Affective attitudes are basically more sort of reasoned versions of that. So you say, I don't like running, or this is, I'm not the kind of person who does X, Y, and Z, right? And so the idea was like, so she wanted to know whether, can we actually change these? Because there's some pretty good literature over the last 10 years that has shown that people who have positive affective associations with physical activity are able to maintain it much longer, right? So this is all around how do we actually support people over the long periods of time in being able to be active. And so what we did is so she developed 3 intervention components for this, and we basically ran a study, and this is a factorial experiment study where for each one of those 3 components, and I'll show you those in just a second, we at baseline randomized each person whether they would get each one of those components. So basically you can think of it as a 2 to the nth experimental design. So if you have 3 components, each one of them can be either on or off, right? Each person gets randomized to one of 8 cells, right? One of the unique combinations of those 3 components. The people had Fitbits, so we could track their physical activity, and we did this again for sort of 6 weeks with one week of baseline. And what we wanted to know for the package as a whole is, do we get a change in these affective associations? But we also looked at some of the other data, including steps and affective evaluations. So the first one of these things that we randomized are these little, basically you can think of them activity suggestions, but they have these little cute animal GIFs that were intended to make people smile, right? That's what, and she had a whole library of these things. They could, waddling penguins and bears sort of pushing against the tree to scratch itself and so on. And the idea was that basically when people see these things, they just smile. And so you can think of this as a very basic form of classical conditioning, right? You're getting something about physical activity, and you're smiling at the same time, that hopefully this is going to be make your attitude towards physical activity more positive. And what we did is people randomized at baseline is whether they got the gifts or not. So both groups got the messages, and they were exactly the same messages. It's just that one of the groups also got these little animal gifts along with the message. The other one just got the messages. The other one were these sort of once a day messages that basically try to bring people's attention to pleasant aspects of physical activity. So, having more energy or feeling less stiff when you're going for a walk, and we would ask people to pay attention to these things. And then the third one was basically a form of planning where we would ask people once a week to make a plan of how to make walking the next week more enjoyable, like listen to podcasts or, walk with a friend or whatever. And so, one cool thing is that across all of our affective measures, there was an improvement from the start of the study to the end of the study, right? So for valuations and attitudes, and so combined, these three things seem to be doing something, right? They were improving people's affective measures. Although when we actually tried to look at that separately by condition, we didn't see much of anything, which is basically saying that there's not one dominant strategy that was really pushing on this, right? So it seems like there was sort of a combination of these things, or also we possibly didn't have enough of a sample size because we actually powered this for the micro-randomized trial that was embedded in this. Where basically for these messages we would randomize whether we sent them to people or not. But the thing that I actually want to show here is this analysis. So we looked at the differences for each condition, right? On steps. And what we saw is that for gifts, the thing in dark, people who got the messages plus the pictures had almost 2,000 steps per day over the course of the study, and those who got those exact same messages without the gifts. Okay? And pretty robust, pretty effect. So for those of you who know a little bit about physical activity research, 1,800 steps improvement is actually quite good. And this is for a single component, right? So this is just the difference of those people who got the gifts or not. And we often have whole packages that roughly give you that much of an impact, right? So this is a pretty strong effect, right? And the question is why, right? So here's my hypothesis, right? So this again is a similar kind of graph that we were seeing previously, but really what gifts were doing in this particular case is very much altering that attitude part that is modifying the intention to go for a walk. So making that more positive allowed the actual message itself to be perceived differently and for a person to actually want to act on that message, right? And so, but this is, I think, one of those examples of where the messages were actually probably doing other things as well, right? So there could be a causal pathway that had nothing to do with I mean, the gifts are working on the effective evaluations and attitudes separately from modifying the actual text of the suggestion to go for a walk today, right? But it's also seems to be modifying how those messages themselves are perceived, right?
Were there any interactions? Or were you interested in interactions?
We did not see interactions, but not. This was really more of a proof of concept study. So she only had something like 45 people. So you just don't. It's underpowered to look at interactions. Yeah. I mean, we actually have a grant under review right now, which would be scale this out both for optimization and to actually do an evaluation. So. What's the case that I'm trying to make here? One is that basically the specifics of the design, including things like user interface, make a difference for these, at least for these digital health interventions that are hoping to change people's behavior. When they're actually altering how the part of the pathway, of the causal pathway, that modifies that main stem, right? That modifies the main process through which these interventions work. If you theorize about this explicitly, you can actually start creating studies that try to look at various variations in the design and how well they're actually doing that, right? And you can start actually measuring those moderators to see whether your hypotheses are correct, right? And I think what that can actually produce is much stronger evidence for how to design these systems effectively, right? So in terms of, to think about what this work should look from an HCI perspective, right? Most of the health behavior work really thinks about impact on behavior. Like that's what, and the design ends up being sort of a secondary thing here. But we can actually do really rigorous design research in this space by really trying to focus on these individual components and trying to study variations of those components and how those variations affect, to what extent those components are effective, right? And what that does is actually starts creating evidence for future projects, right? So the notion of generalizability and in particular sort of transportability. What can I take from project A that I can apply into project B with some confidence that those learnings will carry over is really tricky in this space, right? And so and especially with large randomized control trials that just tell you whether the whole thing did something or not, right? It's really, if it failed, you have no idea which part of it failed. And if it was successful, you don't know which part of it you actually want to appropriate for your next project to make it work better. And so the way that I think this needs to work is that at least if we're thinking about this from a design perspective, is to really focus on components as the analytical units, right? So you want to study individual components and how those components work. Having studies that allow you to sort of study the boundary conditions and the dynamics of how these components can really help. And then you can actually aim to, and all of this presupposes sort of trying to understand what the causal mechanisms through which these components work and where your design decisions are plugging into that. A lot of these experimental designs that are used for optimization, so factorial experiments, micro-randomized trials, smart designs, things of that sort, can really be helpful with that. And I actually want to argue, so can simulations, like running web experiments. And I've got a PhD student that's been doing a lot of that in this space. If you know something about the constructs you're trying to modify, a lot of this stuff can be done in simulation as well. Like you don't necessarily have to deploy in the real world. If you're focusing on things that you can actually study in simulation, like whether someone's knowledge increased, whether they, or if it has something to do with visual perception, right? Can they distinguish between the various designs? In which case you can have large studies that can be done pretty efficiently. So I'll stop there so we have some time for discussion. A bunch of collaborators who worked on this, and yeah, thank you for your attention. I'd love to take any questions.
Thus far, it seems like most of the studies you've put out are in older populations, which I understand the motivation from the health standpoint. Have you done any work that looks at younger populations and how they might be desensitized differently to technology?
Yeah, we have. And in fact, a couple of later deployments of this HeartSteps population had a much more diverse samples in terms of the age. One thing that we're seeing is, for example, that there's some ethnic differences in how people use these tools over extended periods of time. So we had a year-long deployment in Los Angeles of a later version of HeartSteps that tried to recruit a large Latino sample into the study as well. And the trajectories of use are quite different than they are for non-Hispanic participants. And a PhD student who was running that work on the project actually just published a paper recently that looks at these differences in patterns of engagement over time. But I think your point is what are the other things that might actually moderate how these interventions work? And I think that's the right question, right? And figuring out then why would a young person potentially respond to these things differently than an older adult, and incorporating that into your causal understanding of the system. Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any? I think about like the explanatory versus predictive power of causal pathway modeling. Do you have any success stories of hypotheses generated from causal pathway modeling that are then confirmed in later experiments? You know what I'm saying? Yeah,
honestly, a lot of the use of causal pathway diagrams for this is just beginning, right? So I think that for example, that planning piece, I think is probably the easiest thing to try to collect some additional data for, because we really can think of sort of time and how much is required in terms of the interaction with the system as being a proxy for attention, right? And so we can start really making hypotheses about how those different variations on the thing would differentially require more or less attention from a person, right? And seeing how they work. So I think they could have. I mean, that's the whole point of what I think the causal pathway here, the diagramming here, can do for you is to really create hypotheses about what should matter, right? And then generating new data to confirm that. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for this really thought-provoking talk. I was just curious, like, one way of thinking about this, some of the stuff you're doing here is like you take a psychological theory and then now the design component is like figuring out how do you translate that psychological theory into something that, moves the dial on people's behavior. But I'm just wondering, like, to what extent you see this as really being isolated to that translational part of the process versus just the actual theory development. Because, like coming from the psychological world, and you see all these findings that don't replicate and this and that, and it feels like this might be an issue that's happening actually much earlier in the process as well, even in the just when I'm trying to test a psychological theory, like how do the kind of individual design components of the study impact the results I get, right? And so I guess I'm curious, like, if you were to give advice to the people earlier in the process, and if you have anything that kind of speaks to this idea, or just your thoughts on
fabulous question. Yes, I think actually one of the key things that you can do with especially with things like micro-randomized trials is improve theory development, right? So if you think about how most of our psychological theories are currently stated, right? They're pretty static, right? They don't take into account the time into account at all, right? And most of the data that's supporting those theories came from cross-sectional studies with very few observations, right? You either do a single time survey or you'll give people a survey at the beginning of the study, 6 months in, at the year, and so there's very little granularity in terms of what is actually happening in the changes of these constructs over time. So one of the things you can do with micro-randomized trials is treat the intervention component that's being micro-randomized as really a microscope on a construct, right? So if you think that like you can have, let's say you have a component that's helping someone increase the commitment to a goal, right? If you can actually randomize that over time, right? Now you can actually start studying, well, when do you actually need additional commitment? When do you not, right? What other aspects of the context are important to seeing to whether additional commitment makes a difference or not, right? You can start having much more granular theories of how these processes are unfolding than what came from classical psychology. And in fact, I have colleagues who've been trying to use dynamical system modeling to do this, and really sort of reframe some of the classical theories, in particular social cognitive theory, as a set of mathematical equations that are much more dynamic in terms of how the influences are taking place. But for that, you need this kind of data, right? You really need much more granular temporal data where you can do sort of experimental manipulation on some of the constructs that the theory contains. And I think the best way to do that is through intervention. Like that's what an intervention does. Like it's targeting constructs. So I think that's precisely where I think a lot of this work needs to go in terms of the informing behavioral science, is for building better theories, and just a fair bit of discussion around that.
Can I build on that?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to build on that question and then translate it over to the design side again. So as I sort of interpret your question, it's like we have these big, bold claims that say X replicates or X doesn't replicate. And if I'm interpreting your claim correctly, it's basically like saying, well, the ones that don't replicate may just not have met the preconditions or activated the moderators or so on. And so like when we run a meta-analysis and say this replicates or doesn't, what we're really saying is like sampling from the distribution of people who attempt to do this thing, exactly some of whom are going to like get all the preconditions and others who won't. It's going to work about this percentage.
That's exactly what it is. And like it washes out all of the differences around the context in which these things were done, and all of the differences in when it actually worked versus not.
So then, what do we do with that then? Because let's say the causal pathway is correct. Let's say the theory is correct, but most people can't implement it correctly. Yeah. Right? Then that becomes challenging for the theory to sort of. Like, there's all this debate about do nudges work, right? There's been a big pushback, and maybe it's all no effect, but maybe actually it's just that we can't design it effectively, so to speak. And it also feels like the whole to claim playing 20 Questions of Nature
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
critique. It's like we go for these huge main effects, and then like, well, it turns out that like it works in this particular very like if you do this and that and feed them, cherries the night before, it all comes together and works. And so, how do we reason about this in terms of like, when we create these interventions, and they can be so dependent on the details of the implementation, how do we teach this? How do we do design there? How do we know if we're just wrong or if we, should have fed them cherries?
Yeah. So, two answers to that. One is, I think if you look at the sort of the strength of the evidence in behavioral science, going back 70 years on behavior change, right? All pretty much that sort of the key thing that you see is a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the effect across. Like we know. So even the things that we say work with a standardized effect size of about 0.3, right? For some people it worked brilliantly. For other cases it doesn't work at all. And most of the effects are basically really pretty weak, right? And part of the reason for that, I think, is that we are missing all of these sort of operating conditions under which a particular thing works. And so in terms of, I think there's sort of two pieces to your question. One is, how do we actually study this? And then how do we design for it, right? So as an intervention designer, I'm actually not particularly interested in main effects. Because main effects are those things that are going, and you saw that here, like for both.
Write books with single word.
I know, right? That's a horrible thing, right? But really, what I want to know is, when does this thing work? So for that planning, I don't know why the hell people didn't want to plan on weekends. Like, that's actually pretty interesting, right, for that population. But if I do know that, then I develop it. Then my intervention policy is not to send them planning on weekends. Right, and so I think part of the answer to your question is, we actually need to collect a lot more data about the context in which these things are being used, right? And because then you can actually start seeing, well, does actually eating of cherries help, right? If it does, then you have separate questions like, well, what about eating of cherries? Would eating apricots also help, or is it just cherries? Something about cherries that makes a difference, and then you can start theorizing from that, right? But in terms of so which then informs the behavioral theory. But in terms of design, I think the key issue here is that what we want to do is collect the kind of data that can allow us to create intervention policies that actually work, which is meaning that we send things in context in which they're most likely to be effective, right? And so a lot of these moderation analyses are actually far more interesting from the purposes of designing interventions than main effect analysis, because main effect analysis typically, especially in a year-long study, like for any of these components, if I marginalize over time, you're going to get nothing. Like, you're just not going to get anything. And you're not going to get anything because half of the time they didn't do, they just disconnected from the intervention altogether, right? But if I actually look at the pockets of the conditions under which an intervention worked, I can both encode that into the intervention policy, as well as start really thinking carefully about what about that context is helping this intervention work correctly, in which case should learn something more about how these interventions are actually working.
In that sense, it feels like these theories are more like design patterns than they are like prescriptive, like precise theories. It's sort of like, in general, this kind of approach can work.
And honestly, a lot of our interventions are more theory-inspired than theory-based, right? But that's to your point, is because the theories themselves don't have the level of granularity to actually be able to guide design, right? So you kind of know, on average, goal setting is good, except when people hate goal setting, and in which case it's not good, right? But it's too abstract of a level to really guide design in a very informed way. And so I do think that sort of that translational piece, where figuring out, okay, when exactly does goal setting work for this particular population, is the data that we need to be able to do better design, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding your study design, because we are currently working on a study that exactly does this, like understand the context and what kind of intervention is best for which context. But you mentioned, so for this randomization, you had 50% of the chance for the baseline, and then I think 25% and 25% for the different interventions.
Yeah.
What is the reason why you choose different amount of randomness levels?
Versus
why not
third. So this is straightforward sort of power, statistical power 101, right? 50-50 randomization gives you the most power, right? And so, and often also what we see with pretty much all behavioral interventions is that the largest contrast is usually between doing something and not doing anything, right? And so a standard way of powering trials is for that contrast, and then the other stuff ends up being exploratory analysis, right? So if you're resource constrained, then so trying to get some initial signal on, is this thing actually doing anything at all, right? Is the primary research question you want to be powering on, and then the other stuff ends up being exploratory analysis. If really what you care about is the distinction between the designs, then you power differently. Then you could in fact power for a third, or actually overpower for the when you provide these interventions and have 40% of not providing anything at all, or I mean there are different ways of doing it, but it's driven by what's the primary question you're trying to answer. Like honestly, when it comes to you can think of statistical power in studies as being, where am I going to place my bet? Right? The more analysis you run, the more chances you have of seeing stuff just by chance, right? And so the question is like, what's the first analysis that I'm going to be most confident in, that is going to answer and that analysis needs to be answering the question that you're most interested in, right? The cost to that, right? If you're mostly interested in things that are really around this kind of contextual moderation, right? Then you have to power for that, which basically means like if, in the case of those little suggestions, for example, we were tracking where people were, the location of it, like, and we had like home, work, other, right? If really what you care about is whether the location where you send someone something matters, right? Then your power analysis basically needs to be done in a way where so to estimate the proportion of time people are going to be at those various places and power appropriately, right? So you're powering for the times when someone is going to be at home versus at work, right? And so it really comes down to what's your main research question, and I mean, and then balancing that, of course, with resource constraints, right? If you're trying, for a lot of these studies, if you're really trying to power for some of these interactions, you end up needing 1,000 people. Like that's not a small HEI study anymore, right?
Thank you.
Unless you're able to do it online, in which case 1,000 people might be okay, right?
It's still expensive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering why we need to compare across individuals rather than just like randomizing within an individual, because like maybe for me eating cherries affects whether I walk the next day, but for other people it doesn't. And I think this relates to my second question, which is like, to what extent would you agree or disagree with an approach that doesn't think about these design theories or causal pathways, but just tries to deploy a single RL algorithm for every single person and tries to learn like the optimal interventions by
for each person?
experimenting with them.
Both excellent questions and very connected, right? And so in fact, in all later versions of these interventions, we're using RL, right, to personalize provision of these components, right? Partly because, the response, there is heterogeneity in the response between people, so RL will pick up on that. So, one thing, so in terms of why not just do ideographic models, right, and just model each individual person, you can do that, but you just need a fair bit of data. Like you need a lot more time. You're always trading, like you're trading time for people, right? And so the analysis for these micro-randomized trials basically pool within person and across person contrasts, right? And so they're a little bit more efficient than trying to do this for each person separately. We have done that actually, and with using ARX and those kinds of techniques. But then you really do need a fair bit of time or interventions that are randomized frequently enough. So for those kinds of activity suggestions that we randomize 5 times a day, that's pretty easy to do within a single person. But for RL, one of the things that we're seeing is that if you just deploy an RL for each person separately, it takes it quite a long time to learn, right? And so what we're starting to do is basically pool data across people adaptively. So when you and I look similar in a particular set of context, then the RL can learn from my responses and apply it to you. But when we look very different, then it's going to sort of just learn on your own data, right? And so a lot of the sort of more recent work that we've been doing on DRL is trying to do that kind of adaptive pooling, where to try to get basically best of both worlds, right? Get highly individualized intervention policy, while still, insofar as you can learn something from other people, do that to speed up learning. Yeah.
Last question, please.
So going back to sort of that discussion about sort of studies perhaps not generalizing and how it's often these contextual factors or these interaction effects that are really important. I'm sort of, I guess my question is sort of across studies in kind of an ideal world, what might you think could researchers do to sort of help facilitate kind of the surfacing of these more like contextual factors? Either in sort of the way they frame the question or the types of data that collect or the way they measure it.
Well, I mean, the first thing you have to do is measure them. Like if you don't have that information, there's nothing you can do. But this also relates to this last question. One of the reasons you actually want to run studies across people is to figure out what generalizes and what doesn't, right? And so if you just have individual level models, I mean, ultimately we still want to do science, right? And which partly has this question of transportability. What about how you respond is something that is unique to you versus what is more common to human condition, right? And I think that the key way to try to figure that is, like, it doesn't necessarily have to generalize at this highly sort of abstract level that goal setting works, right? It could be that what generalizes is this sort of cluster of conditions under which a particular strategy is effective, right? And if you're collecting enough contextual data, you can actually start unpacking that. And it might be that for most of you around here, right, for physical activity, like this, particular kind of, planning works if you cannot have very much activity in the last few days, right? If the weather is going to be nice the next day or whatever, like, and knowing that stuff is actually super useful, because that becomes then the aspect of the policy that gets embedded into the intervention, right? But then we can also ask, why are these conditions the things that matter, and start theorizing about that, which again pushes the science forward.
Excellent. Let's thank our speaker one more time.